first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to the seminar and to talking to us and talking about the role of the independent healthcare provider network. And so just because you're probably not as well known to us all, do you want to just explain where you came from and how you sort of became Chief Executive and what your background is?
Very, very happy to. And first of all, thank you, Mark, for the invitation. I'm sort of really looking forward to the discussion. So I've been doing this job now for 6 years, and the job that I originally applied for in the dim and distant past, I think that picture must have been taken before I'd started in this job, was Chief Executive of the NHS Partners Network, because back in 2013, when I sort of applied for that job, industry representation was split between NHS Partners Network that looked after members' interests on the NHS side and IHO, which looked after members' interests on the private side. Subsequent to that, we've sort of brought that together, and IHPN is now the sort of single representative voice for the UK provider sector, IS provider sector. Prior to that, I had started and ran a London-based political lobbying company, which became a sort of top 10 UK lobbying firm, and had then also run a trade association for private equity investors in health infrastructure program called LIFT. So I think those are the two things, that kind of public affairs, political background, and then the kind of health sort of investment background, I think sort of came together and probably led to what was obviously a successful application for the NHSPN chief exec role. And I remain sort of fascinated by that, sort of link between healthcare, investment, kind of government politics. It's just such a fascinating and fast-moving environment, and I guess never more so than 2020.
So, John, for those of us again who don't quite understand the relationship of all the private hospitals and what your role in it and how much actual clout you have in terms of the governance, what is this sort of provider network, and how does it all? Do you have regular meetings? Are you chairing them? Can you just say do this and they all just do it? How do they work?
I've spent most of this summer telling NHS England, or reminding NHS England, that I have absolutely no power over the providers. Our role is very much to be the trade association for the provider market. So in the same way that the Food and Drink Federation look after that market, or obviously the CBI on a much larger scale sort of represent UK business. Our job is to represent and to support the UK independent healthcare market. In membership are all of the big private hospital groups that you would expect. Names that you'll be familiar with in London, HCA and London Clinic and John Lizzie's and Cleveland Clinic, recent joiners for us, but also outside of London as well. But we also represent the wider sweep of independent sector providers in areas like diagnostics, in community services, in primary care, in clinical home healthcare, and so on. So, it very much is the home of the independent healthcare sector, who are in many ways united by a series of political, operational, and regulatory opportunities and challenges, which bring them all together. And our job is to try and represent them as best as we can.
I mean, I think we struggle to know where the power sort of lies in that sort of relationship. I mean, is it more that he just tells you what you've got to say?
It's a two-way thing. I mean, we're very lucky at IHPN to have on our board many of the chief executives of those organisations. So John, as an example, is on the IHPN board, but as is Paolo Pieri from BMI Circle, Justin Ash from Spire, Brian from Cleveland Clinic. We'll shortly be announcing our first ever independent chair, which will be an interesting development for us. We've always had a member chair, but I think in effect the way in which we work is that those individuals come together and endeavour and generally succeed, I think, to leave their individual company interests at the door and assess what is needed on a pan-industry basis, and then give us a mandate to go away and do that. And often that will be going with the grain of what they want to see. Sometimes there will be moments where we have to challenge back the industry, and I think one of those areas that I can think of in recent years, not because the providers were unwilling to move, but I think it needed a real shove, was making sure there was a collective response to the case of Ian Patson. which it was clear to me, 3 or 4 years ago, that was going to drive material change in the way in which, the kind of private hospital sector worked, the safety agenda, the relationship with consultants, the liability point, a whole range of issues. And frankly, that did, that needed an independent coordinating entity to push the members to say, well, look, we need to come together and we need a clear position on this. We need to get ahead of the issues, and make sure we're responding responsibly and properly to those points. But it can only be done with the consensus of the industry. We're not a regulator. We're not a standard-setting body. We function by trying to command respect, and in many ways, actually, I think that's a more powerful way of working than when you're simply able to insist that people do things in a particular way. I think that has downsides as well as sometimes obvious upsides.
So you mentioned Patterson. Of course, if we were talking a year ago, I suspect that would be dominating, the conversation. So we asked actually Health Code, and it was quite a nice sort of reflection, really, that if we turn the clock back to January 2020, what would have been your view then of the private sector and where things were evolving? So I know it's difficult to always, but I mean, I suspect it would have been things like Patterson that would have been most dominating your time, wouldn't it? Because that's I
think that's right. It's very interesting. I had a little bit of time off at the end of August, and just before I did so, looked back at the IHPN business plan for 2020-21, which we wrote in February, and then I hadn't looked at since. Since then, simply because what happened in March upended absolutely everything and the best laid plans and all the rest of it. But going back and looking at it, actually, yes, the world has changed, but some of these things remain really current. So the response to Patterson, I sit on the government advisory group. That's supporting ministers in developing the government response to Patterson, which is still due to respond before Christmas, by the way, and that's been, to use their horrible phrase, unpaused. But clearly that would have been a much bigger, I think, process over this summer than ultimately it was. And I think another area, and I think we should come back to this and work with the LCA on this as well, is we were looking at what could be done to better promote London as a destination for international patients, and to see how we could work in a more collaborative and constructive way, both within the industry but also with government, to try and grow the overall share of the cake globally. And I think that's something that we ought to come back to. So they're just two sort of areas that I think, if I'd have been sat here in January, I'd have been flagging. They've inevitably slowed somewhat, but I think they remain absolutely essential, and if in many ways actually more so than they were back in January.
At your time again, where would you say the positives and the negatives were in that time?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, and just to thank you and Richard for the sort of the really helpful two-way dialogue over many months now. It certainly helped me to be able to talk to both of you about what you felt the issues and challenges were that were coming up from amongst your members, and hopefully it was useful to, for me to sort of offer frank reflections on where we'd got to with what were often quite complex and sometimes rather fraught, sort of contractual discussions. I think, for me, one of the, I just, thank really, everybody, from amongst your membership, because it's been such a challenge time. And I think particularly in the spring, when it became clear that private practice was going to be, put under huge pressure for what then was an unknown period of time. I'm well aware that was a very difficult period for a number of your members. And I think, if I'm honest, one of my, kind of mea culpas, was I ought to have probably put in place that kind of rapid communication process with yourselves that little bit earlier. When I reflect on that time, it was certainly back in March. I mean, we had 6 days to complete the deal with NHS England, and it was a sort of incredibly intense week. There was the discussions around the contract and the way in which it should be structured, going into what was an unknown surge period at the time. We knew we had to move at speed. We had to put in place Act exemption order, which I think is actually the quickest that's ever been done, to allow us even to have the discussions as a collective to be able to respond to the NHS England sort of request for support, which by the way, I think we had to respond to. I think the alternative was just too grim to countenance. There were things like making sure all of the staff that work in the IS providers were deemed key workers. That was clearly going to be essential for making sure that particularly parents are able to leave children at school and nursery and so on. And I think what was achieved in 6 days actually has, broadly speaking, stood the test of time. I think where my frustrations then lay was it was too slow. What I mean by that, I think we were probably a touch slow on this. NHS England were a touch slow, and we got lost in the system when it became clear that in virtually all parts of the country, actually, that the pressure on the NHS was not as grave as it was predicted to be in March, that the release of particularly non-urgent private and NHS work was slower than I would have liked. Just to give you an illustration, it was the middle of May when NHS England triggered the de-escalation clause in the contract. It was about 3 weeks after that the bureaucracy worked its way through to enable a return to private work. That was slower than it should have been, and unnecessarily slow. And that maybe compounded some challenges in some areas where utilisation was somewhat less than we would have wanted. That said, we're already past the point where 1.5 million NHS patients have been treated under this deal. Virtually all of them non-COVID patients. Will be over 2 million by the end of 2020. We track as an industry the kind of public perception of private healthcare, and high recognition of the deal that was done announced on the 21st of March. And since then, we've consistently been in the top 5 most trusted industries in the UK. We were about number 20 before March. So above, banking and insurance and various other places. And I think that will stand the industry in good stead. And I think there's some other legacy effects as well that will be positive. I think the relationships between the private sector and the NHS are now stronger in some places than they've ever been. I think that's a positive. There is one healthcare system in this country, and we need to work collaboratively. We're now in a position where providers are beginning to support more junior docs in training. I think that is a good thing, and a good thing for the future of the industry. And of course, private practice, particularly in London after the termination of the London sites in early August, and they were off the deal on the 8th of September, has picked back up, I think, very positively, and we could maybe come on to where we see the world going in the months ahead. But I think there is quite a bullish outlook actually about the future of private practice, and that release I think was a good thing. And of course, linked to that was the variation that we needed to make to the remaining contracts of those that were still on the national deal, to ring fence much more capacity for private work. And again, even those providers still on the national contract are seeing good growth in their private volume. So when I sort of look back on it, absolutely there are things that I wish we had done differently, and they principally revolve around communication and pace, particularly when working with the NHS. But I think there's also some very good things that have come from these arrangements, and certainly when they were put in place back in March, that sense of a pressure to get this right was very keenly felt, and I think it broadly stands the test of time. And if you look at recent report from the Health and Social Care Select Committee, Commons Committee, glowing about the extent to which the private sector has stepped up at a difficult time, and compare that to maybe other parts of the private sector in responding to some of the COVID pressures, I think that's quite a good place to be.
In terms of the NHS contract you've mentioned, and I think it has been a complicated process from the outside, and I know there was that publicity that everywhere was empty and nothing was being done, and I know you did some work in explaining to the public all the different centres and what they contributed. Where's that contract going in London specifically at the moment, and what work is being specifically done with respect to this sort of massive waiting list that we're being told exists at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, just for sake of absolute clarity, the expectation is that all providers. So there were 27 providers went into the national deal back in March. That was virtually all of the provider sector. Can't think of any. There was nobody sort of material that was outside of it. That reduced to 18 on the 8th of September after the Central London providers and one or two non-London providers were terminated. All of the those 18 providers that are still on the national contract will terminate on the 31st of December. And then the next phase, the 2021 phase of this, will be a sort of opt-in arrangement based on a national procurement framework. I know a number of London providers have maintained good relationships with those buddy NHS trusts, as they were called, back during the deal, and have done sort of side deals with those trusts to enable NHS patients to continue to be treated in those facilities, and I think that's welcome. Looking ahead, though, I do, if the pressures mount in central London, we need to make sure that the private sector is playing its part in supporting, whilst also maintaining a sort of vibrant and dynamic private market as well. So sort of looking ahead to next year, I think there is a little bit of uncertainty. There is a friction point at the end of the calendar year when the national arrangements conclude, and frankly, trying to migrate from one set of arrangements to another set of arrangements in the middle of winter, when I think we all know that there's going to be quite a lot of pressure on all providers. That's going to be a challenge. We're already seeing some localities. Nottingham was the first this week where they've invoked the surge clause in the national contract, which means they have access again to 100% because of the pressures on NUH. I think some more areas will go into that as well. So there's definitely challenges, but equally we're not where we were in March. We're not having to respond in 6 days to something that sort of came out of the sun us a little bit. But I think getting that balance between supporting the NHS, keeping private practice going, in a good, strong, dynamic way is something we all need to keep a really close eye on.
So can you sort of foresee a situation where there might be a similar type of lockdown in terms of the hell year where you just are taken over again? Is that have people been modelling that at all? Is that on anyone's agenda?
So we had Simon Stevens speak at our annual summit a couple of weeks ago, and that question was asked of him, and I had that discussion with him as well. I think the view is that the world is different now, and that a sort of block booked national deal is highly unlikely. I mean, I guess you can't rule anything out, can you, in the current climate? But is deemed highly unlikely. Clearly, the Nightingales are now in place in a way that they simply were not even sort of thought of really back in the middle of March. I think we'll all have seen the politics associated with the accusation that the NHS largely shut down for anything other than COVID care back in the spring. I don't think it's conceivable that the NHS can do the same. Again, I think they'll have to maintain a broader range of services, however pressured COVID cases become. And I think the other thing that shifted since March, and I think is probably in this sector's favour, is that green pathway sites and maintaining a set of providers where non-COVID patients are treated to give public confidence in the safety of those sites actually is something that's really, really important. And we're really keen to make sure that we're positioning the private hospital sector as a place that is green pathway. You can't say COVID free, but let's say COVID light sites, where sort of non-COVID care can continue and be done safely. And we just need to keep getting that message out there that is something we take really seriously. We must avoid a public confidence collapse in the safety of these services.
I mean, just following on for that, I mean, as a physician, it's not so important because I'm just in an outpatient setup, and that's fairly, that would continue regardless. But I know my surgical colleagues are at the moment struggling to get patients in on the sort of evening shift weekend deal that's currently being offered. And so, if things progress as they might do, you could see something happening where, as you say, the private hospitals are okay doing the NHS work more during the day as they are perhaps at the moment, and that the private sector's going to be struggling to get their patients into hospital. Do you see that as a risk from how things are going?
I mean, I think that inevitably, whilst we remain on the national deal, and even with the variation that's created greater flexibility, you can definitely see those pressures persisting until the end of December. As I say, as of 1st of January, the national block book deal will fall away for all providers, as it has done for those providers in central London, and there will be a much greater degree of freedom over scheduling. Now, clearly, the rate limiting factors for us are not just being on the national deal, because if there is a pull of anaesthetists, for example, back into the NHS, if there are kind of huge COVID pressures, then that will have an effect as well on the amount of work that we can do. But I do see that trajectory of improvement continuing, even if pressures do continue to grow over the coming months. But equally, the headwinds are very real.
It might be quite helpful if David could express his view about the future of the private sector. I mean, I think we're moving away from the traditional view of the private sector as it's been to something completely different. And with all the contracting and the engagement with the NHS, which we're likely to see carrying on for quite some time in certain areas, that may well kill traditional private sector. And I just wonder if David's got any perception of the provider's view of how the future may look.
So, Rosemary, I think I guess we've obviously gone through such a period of change, and actually, I think if I'd have asked this question virtually of the providers sort of on a monthly basis for the last 7 months, I'd probably have had 7 different answers, because I think that's the kind of sense that people have got. Certainly, more recently, I think there's a really, really positive and optimistic view of where private practice and private healthcare can go, partly driven, I think, by the inevitable pressures that we're seeing on the NHS. I mean, the numbers are astounding. When I presented some slides at the Language on Private Acute Conference, and when you look at NHS performance, there were 1,000 people waiting over 52 weeks back in February. There's now 110,000. Half the waiting list is waiting over 18 weeks, and there's 2 million people been waiting over 6 months. So and with a tough winter to come. So I think inevitably there's pressure on the NHS, and I'm hearing from providers that the number of queries and then translations of domestic self-pay patients is really, really quite positive. So I think that we will probably for a period of time be a bit more stitched into the NHS. I think there'll be a bit of lumpiness around that, and I think that will vary by region and by NHS need. But I don't think or predict that we'll be back in the phase we were in the spring, where there was the sort of insurance policy block booking. I think we're already on a path towards an evolution of the relationship between consultants and providers. I think the government response to Paterson will challenge us all again on making sure the practicing privileges model is robust and strong, and the work that we worked on with particularly with FIPO last year, with Sir Bruce Keogh on the medical practitioners assurance framework, I think remains really important there. And there'll be other recommendations that I think will challenge us all. But equally, I've seen a big change in the way in which that dynamic has worked, and a real emphasis and focus on safety, on quality, and let's not forget now 9 out of 10 private acute hospitals are good or outstanding under CQC. That shouldn't ever be seen as the only benchmark, but that is a big improvement over the last 3 years, and that's testament to the work that consultants have done, that providers have done, and all those in the industry have done. So I can see good growth opportunities over the years ahead. I think the international market is something that we do need to look at. I think there's a danger there that we look at that and be fairly fatalistic and say, well, that's dead. I actually think everyone's been challenged in that space, and we need to be first out of the blocks to make sure that we're marketing the UK, but particularly London, I think globally as a place for high quality care. And I'm picking up sort of good mood music around that, and providing, I think, that we continue to invest in the quality and safety agenda, and tell a positive, proactive story that this is a sector that is doing an enormous amount of good, then actually I feel there's a positive future ahead.
What do you see of the role of the PMI industry, if you're talking about a growth in self-pay and a growth in international patients, and a growth in block booking and surge capacity for the NHS? Doesn't leave much space, does it, for PMIs?
Well, I mean, I think PMI remains a really important part of this this market, and clearly there is a period of catch up that's going on at the moment, and I think a fairly positive pipeline is what I hear from the insurers. I think there is opportunity to continue to grow that market. We've all known that we all know that there is an economic hangover coming. That will be a challenge, and corporates and individuals will be under pressure. Equally, some of the kind of survey data that I've seen suggests that actually there are a number of corporates that are looking positively at introducing corporate insurance into their organisations. So I think we absolutely have a collective obligation to present insurance as a good product to have. I think the challenges in the NHS will have a positive effect, I think, on insured lives, but we have to tell a positive story, and frankly it can't all be about a kind of relentless debate about price and cost and that side of it. It has to be a somewhat more inspiring story about the benefits that come with insurance, the quality of services that sit beneath it, both in terms of the consultants and the providers, in order to drive that up.
Anybody else got any questions at this point before we?
Yes,
Richard. Yeah.
Hi, David. Hi, good to see you.
Hi, Richard.
One thing that has been coming up with people at FIPA recently is that hospital providers are starting to move towards employing certain specialties. So we've heard that BMI Circle are starting to take on board staff anaesthetists rather than allowing surgeons to work with the anaesthetist that they have done in the past. We've heard that Spire are wanting to take all their pathology in-house. And this is particularly important from the point of view of histopathologists working with surgeons who are doing a lot of cancer surgery and who have faith in the people that are looking at the specimens. What is your feeling about this? I mean, do you think this is a trend that is going to move towards the sort of American HMO model?
So I think it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, clearly, both Cleveland and Shern have been sort of early movers on a sort of employed model. I think others are undoubtedly looking at that. So I think we'll probably have a mixed model for a period of time. I think that will probably sustain, for some years, because I think you can make both of those things work. But I don't see us going backwards on that model, if you see what I mean, Richard. I think there will be, clearly those that have already gone down that road, I think will probably persist with it. It has some advantages. Equally, I think particularly if we're able to continue to inject ever more vigour and robustness into the sort of PPs model, I can see that having a positive future as well. So I think we may well see both coexisting for a period, but providers will clearly be looking at different ways of doing things and what their options are.
Yeah, this isn't really about the providers and the service they're providing. This is actually about the relationship between consultants and their specialist colleagues and the faith that they have in each other to provide the best services for their patients. So, for example, with MDTs, you sit down there with all the various specialties, including your histopathologist in whom you have faith, this is really interfering with that sort of pathway, isn't it?
It's difficult for me to kind of give a definitive view on that one, Richard. I think there's I think very happy to sort of take that one back to the providers and get a perspective on that. I don't think, certainly the providers are not wanting to do anything which sets us back. So I think that's probably one that very happy to sort of pick that up and see whether or not there's a sort of separate dialogue that we can have with the providers on that point.
I mean, sort of just picking up on that a little bit, David. I mean, it was quite clear from the, I know we've talked about this in terms of the LCA survey in the summer. Obviously, it was at the lowest point of the, and there did seem to be quite a big wave of unhappiness, we'll call it, between the consultants and their hospital providers. And it was the first time I'd sort of seen this disconnect where people were actually saying, well, I've always worked there, but I'm not sure I'm going to work there anymore. And I don't know whether the hospital providers have got a sense of how the consultants are feeling at the moment. And I don't know whether the LCA and its role now is going to help that process. What do you think about that as a concept?
I think Mark and Richard, actually, I think you've got your ability to be able to get that feedback in real time and chart that over the months, I think is going to be really important, because I was concerned to see that. We spoke about that. I fed that back in pretty robust terms to the providers about what I was hearing. They saw that. Now, I can't speak for individual providers, but clearly communication, absolutely vital. People will have done that differently, but absolutely crucial. But what's also clear to me is that if there has been damage done, if there is a relationship challenge, that we absolutely have to repair that. I'm clear with the providers that we have, this has to be priority number one, frankly. And I do think that my plea to both LCA and FIPO is if you are able to kind of gather that information, continue to do that on a sort of periodical basis, and let's sort of chart that, because we want to see that improve, we want to see it repaired. I think where we were back in May, June was a really difficult time for consultants, because the level of private activity was well off where it should have been, and I think there was a frustration at that point that frankly the NHS wasn't actually in some cases making use of those facilities, yet private practice was still shut out. I think we're in a better place now. I think the market position is better, and obviously in central London, then they're not on that national deal, and even outside, as I said before, there's much more capacity available for private work. Equally, those when you have a bust up, and we all know it from our own lives, then it takes some repairing. So we have to continue to invest in that, but I don't think it's in either party's interest for that to persist. I don't think it's in the provider's interest at all to have a bunch of individuals who are feeling bruised and frankly fed up, but I don't think it's in the consultant's interest for that to persist either, because we only work when we work well together.
I think what surprised us a little bit was how little the consultant body was involved at any of the various processes. And I mean, we would say that we are, providing the income for the various people that you represent. And so to be seen as so low down the priority, I mean, and it was almost, when I spoke to one of the executives, it was almost like he hadn't even thought of it. And that just seemed an odd sort of concept to us. So I think, and I agree with you. So maybe this has been a way of, demonstrating the importance of the consultant body.
I mean, I think, and I'm not saying this simply because I'm on an LCA call, but I think the LCA and FIPO as well do a great job of representing members' interests. We share common challenges as a private healthcare industry. Okay, we may have slightly different perspectives, but I think always kind of coming to the table, willing to come forward with ways that things can be improved, done differently, it just remains so critical. We try and do that as IHPN on behalf of the provider voice, as well as sort of calling things out, and we think that they're wrong, and therefore sort of not just assessing, okay, what do people think and what's wrong with the world, but also how can we actually, how can we contribute to making that better is I think something that's really important.
Jeffrey, you probably knew the IHPN before David was around. Is it completely transformed as an organisation and much improved now?
Seems to be going very well. I mean, there are a number of issues. The employment that Richard mentions, I mean, we know that the Cleveland and the Shone are doing it, but you know, the wind blows from the west, and what's happened in the United States in every aspect of care going through way back from managed care onwards has come here eventually. And currently 70% of the doctors are employed now in the United States in a multi-system type provider system. But I don't want to dwell on that, but really about how the insurers have reacted. I mean, you've touched on it in a way. And how do you see their drive in the coming months? I mean, you've hinted that people will, and firms will perhaps be facing financial difficulties, and there may be fewer subscribers. How do you view them?
So I mean, look, we have a positive relationship with the insurers and talk regularly, particularly through the ABI as I guess their representative body. I think, you know, we're coming, you know, we've been through a difficult phase, but the next 12 months are going to be tough. There's some big unknown questions, I think, on the state of the economy. Personally, I'm generally a glass half full person in most things, but I have to confess I really worry about where the economy goes over the next 12 to 18 months. And, you know, whatever your view of that, I think there has to be a doubling down of the value in PMI that is done in a way that is about value to people, not just simply about price. And, you know, because insurance remains such a big part of private healthcare market, and I think a really valuable part of the private healthcare market, you know, we have to, I think, tell a story to the public about the advantages and benefits that go with that. We have to be innovative. You know, we all have a role to play in that, actually, because we all benefit from a dynamic insured market. So I think there's, you know, a real need to kind of get hold of it, look at it, and really make sure that, you know, we're holding on to, you know, policies where they're under pressure, but also trying to move into new spaces as new employers arise, as new industries sort of emerge, you know, making sure that story is told about the, you know, kind of innovative product. Otherwise it will be under pressure, and we can't simply rely, I don't think, on you know, the NHS being under pressure in order to automatically drive people in that direction. It has to be much more imaginative than that.
Yeah. Can I ask, then, going to the hospitals? You've hinted, obviously, there will be a change over at the end of the year. Some of us thought that what was going on was effectively a nationalisation of the private hospital sector in many areas of the country, perhaps not in the big cities. How do you view that concept?
So it's very difficult, isn't it, to know, to say with confidence what would have happened if in different circumstances, but I think I can say with some degree of confidence that, having been brought into NHS England on the 13th of March, and sort of presented with the epidemiological modelling and the ITU modelling, and asked to help, I think, had the sector at that stage have said no, not that I think it would have done, but had it have done so, I think we'd have probably still found ourselves in a situation.
I quite agree with that. I'm talking about the future.
Yeah,
I think,
yeah.
well, everything you did was quite appropriate. There was no other way. I do understand. I'm talking really about a long-term future. I mean, some hospitals are in, let's put it, parlous sort of financial status before, in some parts of the country, as you know, and this may be a sort of lifesaver for them. And so I know from colleagues around the country that they are worried that there will be no private facilities. It'll effectively become NHS when you think of the backlog that they have to cope with. Is that the fear? I'm talking about the future, not what you did before.
Yeah. So, I recognise the fear, and I think, you know, there's clearly over 200 private hospitals in England, and they will all have different pressures and different challenges. I don't think, however, that looking forward, that we'll end up in a position where material number of sites or providers, you know, end up in effect just turning themselves over to be NHS providers. You know, I think there probably will be more NHS patients seen in the private sector over the course of the next 5 years or so. You know, that move we've seen over the last 20 years to increase that, I think, is probably going to continue. But equally, I am actually quite positive about the future of private practice, and therefore, as an investable proposition, private hospital facilities. So, you know, I don't think we're in the territory of large-scale sort of nationalised private healthcare, but we all have a responsibility to make sure that the product remains competitive, you know, and that people see it as a you know, a safe and effective place to want to get treatment.
Just on that note, David, that Brian's just raised the point that, you know, with the, when I went on the Wellington a few times, you know, there's obviously the NHS patients alongside the private patients. Has any thought gone into that in terms of how the private patients who are paying feel that are being alongside the patients that aren't on the NHS? Is that a difficult that model where you're treating both in the same unit at the same time, and one's paying and one isn't? How does that quite square with?
Yeah, I think I would distinguish between that dynamic under the national contract, simply because I think, you know, it was a different set of arrangements to how that is done ordinarily. I've seen it done, you know, well, and I've seen it done badly. I think, you know, I've seen areas where, in effect, you walk into the reception and there's an arrow one way for one set of patients, an arrow another way for another set of patients, and you know that's how it's done. I think, you know, we will continue to see, I think, in particularly in central London, a real focus on private patients, on the importance of access, on the importance of the wider benefits that go with private healthcare, and I think it is a policy challenge that a lot of providers will need to grapple with as they do take more NHS patients, about how you ensure that, you know, it remains you don't cheapen the deal, as it were. You know, but I think given the huge access pressures that are likely to be there for the NHS, I think there is a real opportunity to tell a kind of positive story about speed, about quality. We have to continue to improve quality and tell that story as well. And I do think this point about green pathways, about sort of, you know, good, strong IPC measures, you know, is just going to be a really important calling card for this sector, you know, for both private and NHS patients, but a real opportunity on the private side.
So whether you'd engaged with Finn at any level, and where they had any role in this sort of time, or, I mean, have they been involved at any level in any of these discussions or plans?
So I'm a director of Finn, the industry body. Back in 2012-13 was given a sort of nominated position on the board of Finn, and I inherited that just over two years ago. So you know, I think, you know, obviously over the period of the national contract, Finn's role was to sort of take a bit of a step back, simply because the amount of activity was lower. Finn actually provided a lot of support to a number of those private hospitals that had traditionally never done NHS work, to help ensure that some of the data feeds that you just have to do routinely for NHS work were understood by those providers, and I think that actually really helps with some of the bureaucracy. I think on the broader point, you know, my view is that, you know, there is a significant burden for consultants on reporting information. You know, we espouse a, you know, submit once, use multiple times approach, which we just have to begin to get to. Otherwise, there's a danger you just become totally swamped in bureaucracy. You know, clearly it's the case that the CMA order remains in force, and that, you know, we need to fulfil that order. And frankly, whilst that order remains unfulfilled, our critics, of which haven't been too many in recent months, but the critics of private healthcare, and we're all in that basket, will use failure to deliver on that order as a reason to beat us up. So I think, for me, we have to do that, but there's also a need to take a step back and to streamline some of the data submission processes, and to make it much simpler, frankly, for the public to see what's going on, and also to link up to kind of key safety initiatives where they're in place as well.
To me, the key differentiator about the private sector is individualised care rather than the treating of populations. And that should be the one thing that will remain common regardless of whether there are both NHS and private patients being treated virtually next to each other. The private sector is a consultant-led service, but indeed it may not be able to be a consultant-led service if it's being driven by consultants who are employed within the establishment. So I can see that there could be a lot of tensions and indeed a destruction of the expertise and the quality of care in the future.
That's a good point, David. I mean, I know people try to set up chambers and they sort of say, if you can't see me, here's someone you can see instead of type approach. You might have a group of dermatologists or something like that. And it's never quite the same, is it? Because usually the patient wants to see the consultant they want to see, don't they? And so however much you try and dress up that model, it is a difficult one to sell in private practice when people are paying a lot of money.
And I think we need to be very cognizant of that. I think it's a very, very strong point, and clearly times change, and individuals may have different kind of views, but that link with the consultant and the importance of that continuity, and as Rosemary says, that kind of individualized care, which is a differentiator, frankly, remains important. I think that's absolutely right.
Going on with that, David, I mean, one of the things that we have seen over the last 10 or 15 years, from the patient's point of view that is insured with a private medical insurer, is the erosion of choice, whereby so-called open referral gives you maybe a couple of options to go to, which rather puts into perspective what the usefulness of PHIN's data will be if you can't actually use it to choose the consultant that you want to go and see, because your insurer has actually limited the numbers that you can go to, and usually they're the cheapest anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good point, and PHIN data has to have value. It's a CMA driven requirement, and not only do we have to make sure those two things are linked up, we also have to make sure, by the way, that the public make use of it, because we can have the most sophisticated system in the world, but frankly, if nobody makes use of it, it's all a bit of a it's all a bit of a waste of time. So I know PHIN are looking at that and have seen some improvements in that space, but absolutely, we need to be making sure that people are where they want to be seen in a particular place or by a particular individual are able to do that. The data underpins it, and they're not artificially restricted from doing so. We undermine the market if we do that.
Okay, any final questions at all?
I had a question. Hi, David. I know the national contract, the Corona contract, if you like, was based on a cost per case scenario plus lump sum. Can you elaborate on the lump sum?
So it was a cost plus model, to be honest. So it was a block booking where costs were covered, with an element of cost of capital on that as well. So what we're moving to next year will be a cost per patient basis, probably based on the national tariff. But what we've been working on to date has been a block booking type of arrangement where I guess the NHS takes to an extent the utilisation risk. There's been a component of on the private pay side where the provider retains a sum of money from the amount of private work that's gone on, whilst returning quite a large amount of it back to NHS England. But the financial model of the deal has very much been a cost plus one rather than a fee for use one.
And just to thank everyone for contributing and joining in. And David, a really special thank you for both from Richard and I for all your input over the summer and support as well. So we were both very grateful.
No, thank you to you both, and very happy to obviously maintain that dialogue and come back if you felt that it would be welcome to do so. So thank you for the invitation.